I'm a professor in the Institute for the Oceans and Fisheries, and I'm really pleased today to introduce my new friend, Kathy Mills. Kathy and I just spent a weekend together, actually with Simon Donner as well. We were together for a few days on Vancouver Island this week, because Kathy has just been given the world's top award in marine conservation, the Pew Fellowship in Ocean Conservation, Marine Conservation, and take my word for it, she's good. Okay. So I've only heard a small talk from her and had some exchanges and discussions with her, but I'm particularly interested to hear a full-length expose of the work she's been doing. Kathy has a hugely complementary and comprehensive set of interests. She's a research scientist at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, and she looks at sort of every influence there is on fish communities, fisheries. So she's interested in the ecological and the anthropological and the economic, and particularly in the context of changing environmental conditions, climate change, and things like that. So Kathy is going to share some of those thoughts with us. She's a lot of modeling tools, and I think some of that will come out today too. So thanks very much.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming out and for tolerating the slight delay. And Amanda has certainly set high expectations here. I don't usually get nervous, but now I'm really nervous about meeting those expectations or coming anywhere close. So it's great to be here. I've learned so much from my visit to the West Coast about some of the similarities as well as differences in some of the fisheries issues we're confronting on our different coasts. So I'm really excited to share with you some of the work I've been doing back on the east coast of the U.S. And we look forward to follow-up questions and conversations around that. So my talk today is going to focus on three themes. The first part will introduce you to some of the patterns of warming that we are seeing along the northeast shelf of the United States. The second piece will talk a bit about some of the impacts that we're already detecting in terms of how warming is affecting fish populations and fisheries. And then the third piece will move into some of my more recent work around climate adaptation in fisheries. How can we prepare for and respond to these changes? So just to orient you, when I talk about the northeast U.S. shelf, I'm really talking about this body of water, our shelf area that extends from, in the south, this is North Carolina, up all the way to the Gulf of Maine, so Nova Scotia would be the peninsula coming down here. So, not just what you typically think of as the northeast U.S., but sort of the mid-Atlantic region up through the Gulf of Maine. And in this region, we have been looking at some of the changes in sea surface temperature that have occurred over time. So I'm going to show you a series of plots oriented across time in terms of temperature anomalies. So how different is temperature in 1 year from the long-term mean temperature. So this shows you the pattern in our satellite record going back to 1982 for this region. And what we see over time, we've been warming at about 0.03 degrees Celsius per year. This might not sound that dramatic, but relative to the rest of the global average, we're warming about 3 times faster than the global average. When we think about ecosystem effects, they don't necessarily always play out over 30 plus years. So when you look at this most recent pattern here, for the past 10 years, we've actually been warming at about 1/4 degree Celsius per year over that time frame. So when you sort of isolate that time frame and think about the influence of that warming on organisms in the ecosystem, we see some pretty dramatic effects that I'll dig into a little bit later. And this warming pattern that we're seeing, a long-term warming trend in the region, this is showing warming trends grid cell by grid cell. At what percentile would the warming rate in that cell be? And so it's only plotting from about the 80th percentile up. And you'll see that the northeast U.S. really jumps out in this bright yellow and extends up into the Labrador Sea and across the North Atlantic. So this region's actually been warming faster than about 99% of the world's oceans, which is a remarkable warming rate. And it's projected to continue warming at some of the highest warming rates of any portion of the world's ocean. So we are really concerned about what the long-term trajectory could mean, and also how we can build the potential for people to be able to respond to some of the changes in timeframes that better match rates of change that we're seeing in the ecosystem. So in addition to the long-term warming trend, we're also seeing more and more warm events. So this is a map showing temperature anomalies during a heat wave that we experienced in the Northwest Atlantic in 2012. So this heat wave extended from Cape Hatteras in North Carolina up into the Labrador Sea and over to Iceland. In the Gulf of Maine region, which is where much of my work focuses, temperatures were 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius warmer than the long-term average for much of that summer period. And I'll talk a bit about some of the ramifications of this in just a few minutes. And essentially during that 1 year, we got a glimpse of what temperatures might look like at the end of the century based on some of the projections that we expect from the climate models. We've also seen heat waves since that time as well. In 2016, if you apply the definition of heat waves that Hobday et al. Just came out with, we would have experienced a heat wave during a large chunk of that year. In 2012, though, the really dramatic warm temperatures occurred in the spring as things were warming up. In 2016, it was more a warm late summer into the fall. So the ecosystem consequences seem to play out very differently. And again in 2018, we had some days this year where the temperature, the color bar that we used for temperatures wasn't sufficient. We had days where water temperatures were more than 5 degrees Celsius warmer than the long-term average. Sort of watch this move from off of the Scotian Shelf and into the Gulf of Maine for several days and weeks. So we are seeing more and more warm events. And we're also experiencing detectable changes in seasonality. So when you think about when spring warming occurs and when fall cooling occurs and what happens in the middle there, if you define that middle as summer, even though it may not align with our calendar summers, we see the length of summer is increasing in this region. And in the Gulf of Maine, this expansion of what feels like summer in the ocean has been occurring at a pace of about 2 days per year since the satellite temperature record started in 1982. So this has a lot of consequences for the timing of events and phenology of life history patterns and species movements and things like that in the system. So now I'll move into telling you a bit more about some of the impacts on species and fisheries that we are observing. And these have taken many different forms across lots of different species. So we're seeing changes in terms of distribution, spatial distribution, as well as temporal distribution, which gets into some of the timing issues. Productivity of different populations, and I'll go into both of those a bit more. But we're also seeing changes in predator-prey relationships and disease and pathogens that are affecting some of our shellfish as well as aquaculture operations. So these are all important, and they're playing out across a wide variety of species, from shrimp to some of our commercially important demersal species, pelagic species like squid, and then some protected species like Atlantic salmon that aren't commercially fished. So I'll just start by telling you a bit more about some of the spatial distribution changes that we're observing. For many of our fish and invertebrates, we're seeing a shift toward the north and toward deeper depths over time. We have a trawl survey that the Northeast Fisheries Science Center runs that goes back to the late 1960s. So if you look across that time period, you see detectable, in some cases, quite dramatic shifts in where species ranges are centered. This is an example using silver hake. So you can see that in 1968, and for much of the 70s, silver hake was concentrated at the shelf break around the mid-Atlantic. And in more recent years, this habitat has sort of been left behind, and they're concentrated in the Gulf of Maine, in further north and deeper waters. We're also seeing a number of species that have traditionally been more representative of the mid-Atlantic fish communities moving into the Gulf of Maine. Black sea bass is one example. People in Maine are still not really even familiar with this fish, but lobstermen are picking it up in their lobster traps on a very regular basis now. We get lots of reports of species that are sort of just ephemeral. I'm sorry? Super wonderful species. I didn't even realize I had the example that would be so appropriate for you. So, lots of species that intrigue people. They don't show up often, but seahorses, some small tropical juvenile fish that stray into the region. But even the straying pattern is new. And then longfin squid is a great example. You'll see here where its distribution typically occurs based on observations in the fall trawl survey. In 2012, when we had this big heat wave, there's actually a fishery that developed for squid just in the course of that season in the Gulf of Maine. Typically, squid is ephemeral there. You see it show up in the coastal waters occasionally during the summers, but it kind of comes and goes. It's typically much more offshore if it comes into the Gulf of Maine at all. In 2012, it came in and it stayed, and people started fishing for it. Fishery built up along with the markets for that just in the course of one season. We're also seeing that as species move, so are fisheries. So this is an example of summer flounder. What I'm showing here in the black line is where the observations of the species have been in our trawl survey. And you'll see for this last part of the time series, it has been shifting northward. This is the center of latitude. The green line is where vessels on the water are fishing. So from our vessel trip report data, where have they been catching summer flounder? And you see the fishery is trending northward along with that as well. And what this looks like spatially is shown in the map. So in blue is sort of where the fishery was catching summer flounder in the late 1990s. And you can see that that was concentrated off of North Carolina and Virginia. By 2011 through 2013, the red shows where they were taking most of their catch. And it had moved northward to off of New Jersey and New York. And we're also starting to see summer flounder showing up even north of Cape Cod, which is sort of a natural geographic break. We're also seeing effects on productivity of a number of different populations. And these are all examples that are important commercially fished species in our region. Atlantic cod has been declining. Northern shrimp has also been declining. They can't reproduce in temperatures that we're experiencing. And lobster sort of has a two-dimensional story with southern New England stocks, which are in the warmer portion of the range, really experiencing major declines, whereas the Gulf of Maine is doing much better. And I will go into both cod and lobster in greater depth in my subsequent slides. So for Gulf of Maine cod, I'm showing you here the spawning stock biomass in blue over time, and you can see that there has been a downward trend in spawning stock biomass. We got interested in this because we had a couple of years of the survey where it looked like they were actually doing better. And then it turned out they were wrong, which caused major disruption in the fishery and in people's sort of perceptions of how reliable the science was. So to tell you a little bit more of that story, as spawning stock biomass declined, we also saw age 1 recruitment also declining. And really what we want to try to think about is how can we take information that we know that we've observed over a long period of time and try to understand more recent patterns and find reliable relationships that could help us in more of a predictive capacity. So we looked at H1 recruitment and spawning stock biomass relationships for this time period through 2004 and used the approach that's commonly used in stock assessments, assuming that spawning stock biomass is going to determine recruitment that comes off of that population. When we developed a model just predicting recruitment from spawning stock biomass, the gray dots show what we got. So you'll see that we really missed that big downturn that happened right before 2010. When we incorporate sea surface temperature into that model, the red diamonds show the pattern that we get, and you'll see that it tracks that downward trend in recruitment much more closely. So essentially, by not accounting for temperature, the potential influence of temperature on stock productivity, the science that was supporting management decisions for this fishery completely missed the fact that the population wasn't performing at the levels that it had been in the past, and we expected it to continue performing at in a constant manner over time. So some of the takeaways here is that warming affected recruitment. I showed you the details on that, but we also saw effects on mortality as well as growth, which were consistent. The growth pattern is very consistent with what you expect for changes in growth that occur with temperature. And mortality, we hypothesized, was related to a shift in predation as migratory species stay in the system longer because the summer season is now more tolerable for a longer period of time. By not accounting for the warming, there were several ramifications for the management system. Quotas were too optimistic, and even though the fishery was following the quotas that were set, overfishing was occurring still, and the rebuilding targets and timelines were overly optimistic. So what we find is that given this influence of temperature on cod productivity, in the US we typically try to recover overfish stocks within 10 years, and it's not really possible to recover this stock of cod in that time frame unless we see a dramatic decline in temperatures and eliminate fishing, like not even cut it way back, but take it down to zero. So the next example I want to introduce you to relates to the American lobster fishery and populations in our region. So this is the most valuable fishery in the United States. It was valued at over $600 million in 2016. I think that's when the last statistics came out. In Maine, which is where I work, there are lots of communities that are really heavily dependent on the lobster fishery. It accounts for more than 85% of all of the marine fisheries value in the state. And in some communities, it's the largest employer and the largest source of income for that particular fishing community. So I want to tell you two pieces of a story there. One relates to how the 2012 heat wave affected American lobster, and the second piece will get into some of the population productivity changes. So in 2012, when we experienced that large heat wave I showed you the map of earlier, essentially what happened is that temperatures warmed up earlier in the spring. So the blue line shows the long-term annual cycle of temperature in the Gulf of Maine. In gray, you see the pattern that we experienced in 2012. And essentially the warm-up in 2012 occurred about 3 weeks earlier than we typically expect it to. This aligned with an early uptick in landings of lobster. In fact, they came online even a bit earlier than you would have expected from the warming, the spring warming pattern. And lobster landings are really tied to temperature for several different reasons. First of all, much of the lobster fishery is a small boat fishery. They fish inshore. So when waters warm up in the spring, lobsters move from the offshore waters into the inshore waters. So they become available to the small boat fishery. They also start just generally becoming more mobile. So they'll move into and out of traps. So they're easier to catch. And the really important factor here is molting. So most of the landings, I think over 88% of the landings of lobster in the state of Maine are a size that has just molted into the harvestable size class. So they're really dependent on this one particular molt cycle in lobster that makes them legal to harvest. And so temperature cues that molting each spring, and you get it happens over the course of the summer, but you get a large chunk of lobsters molting at the same time. We essentially brought more than 14 million pounds of lobster from the U.S. online in June and July that were above the levels that were experienced most years in the past. And so we're dumping a lot of lobster into the supply chain before the supply chain is typically ready to accommodate that lobster. And this mattered a lot in 2012 when pretty much all of our processing capacity was in Canada, and the Canadian season is pegged to calendar dates. So when the U.S. landing started coming online earlier, it overlapped with the Canadian fishery that was still being prosecuted. The dealers weren't ready to transport or store lobsters that were coming in off of the water, and the processors weren't ready to process that lobster. So the result was a major price collapse. We saw prices in July and August of that year that were at the lowest level that we've ever seen since we've been documenting this in the fishery. And it also caused a lot of tension at the border at the processing plants. So the other, that's sort of an effect of temperature playing out over the course of one season. But then looking at some of the longer-term warming patterns, we also see temperature affecting lobster populations in the region. So in these figures, I'm breaking out lobster to its stocks in the Gulf of Maine and in southern New England. In blue, I'm showing the temperature anomalies, and in the orangish red, you see the proportion of landings in those years relative to 1984. So trying to scale some of the volume changes that have occurred. But essentially what you see is that as temperatures have warmed in the Gulf of Maine, first in the top box, that landings have also been increasing. Whereas in southern New England, they have reached sort of a temperature threshold beyond which landings have really declined. And I'll go into this a little bit more. This is some work that Arnaud Labrie, which a few of you in here have met. So this is Arnaud's postdoc work that he did with us. He essentially built a lobster population model that brought the influence of temperature into the population model in a few different ways. And he also set it up to look at effects of some of the management measures that we use and how those play out in terms of shaping the population. So from this model, we're really able to try to tease apart the influence of temperature as well as how different management measures can buffer some of the effects of rising temperatures on lobster. So what I'm showing in this figure is the estimate of the population that is taken from the stock assessment. So if we sort of view this as a depiction of the trajectory of the stocks over time, we can use that as a baseline against which to understand some of the changes that we capture in the model. So we then use the population model to ask the question of what is the influence of temperature and how is that played out differently in the two regions. So we do this by contrasting the population as it has actually played out under observed temperatures that are changing from year to year. Instead, we give it just a constant average temperature and let that be the temperature that's experienced by the lobster, rather than have the population experience the real temperatures that occurred in the two different regions. So the takeaway from this figure is that in southern New England, if we had experienced only average temperatures instead of some of the really warm temperatures we had, we would have expected the southern New England stock of lobster to have been doing quite a bit better than it actually is. In the Gulf of Maine, you'll see that the population is in reality doing better than we would have expected it to under the average temperatures. So the rise in temperatures in the Gulf of Maine has brought that region into a really sweet spot where lobsters are highly favored right now. They're doing great for the time being, and I'll show you in a few minutes what we think might happen in the future. But before I get there, so we do have the actual temperatures. Sorry, I forgot that I had this as a separate slide. But the story is the same as what I just talked through. So the takeaway from this is that temperature changes have contributed to lobster population declines in southern New England and to the increases that we are experiencing right now in the Gulf of Maine. We can also look at management measures and how they may have influenced the trajectory of the populations. So in Maine, we have a really strong tradition of protecting large females. For more than a century now, the fishery has voluntarily been V-notching or marking egg-bearing females and putting those back in the water. This started even at the dealer facilities where they would, if they noticed lobsters develop eggs, they would pull them out from their supply and go take them and put them back in the water. So this is a practice that's been used voluntarily for a really long period of time. So protected the females, and they were also really early to adopt size limits to try to protect the large females in the system, in the population. In southern New England, they've only adopted size limits within the past decade, and they aren't as conservative as we apply in the Gulf of Maine. So essentially, if we had protected the large lobsters in southern New England, the red shows where we would have expected this population to be. And again, it's quite a bit above where the population actually is. In the Gulf of Maine, though, if we had fished on the large lobsters, instead of protecting them, we would have not expected the population to perform as well. So the takeaway here is is that conservation measures can be really important in terms of how they interact with environmental change and the combined effects that we attain in the end. So we saw that by protecting the large females, we were able to enhance the beneficial effects of warming on the population of lobster in the Gulf of Maine, but the lack of those measures in southern New England actually exacerbated the declines. And just to look ahead briefly, when we look at temperatures that we expect to occur in the future, we do expect to see the Gulf of Maine population coming down gradually, getting to a point where the temperatures, instead of being right in that sweet spot, become stressful and reduce productivity, but in a fairly gradual way, taking the population actually back to levels that were experienced in the late 1990s and 2000s. So it's a major decline for a really important fishery, but it's not going to, we don't expect to see a total collapse. So hopefully if we plan well and think about how we can promote resilience to some of these declines, we can buffer some of the human effects of those downturns. In southern New England, we actually project a little blip here because our temperatures are already so warm, they're ahead of the climate model projections, but we do expect the stock to continue to come down or not really reach a point where it would be doing as well as it was in the 1980s in that region. So future warming we expect that it will prevent a recovery in the south, and it may we may experience declines in the northern portion of the range of lobsters. So now I want to talk a little bit about some of the recent work I've been doing around climate adaptation in fisheries. And we can think about adaptation playing out at a variety of scales, both temporal and spatial, but also institutional scales. So for example, when a fisherman is thinking about adapting to some of the changes that are occurring in the ecosystem, a decision that he or she might face is, do I stay in this fishery or do I move into something else? Do I get out of fisheries altogether and pursue a different type of endeavor? A community may be thinking long-term, but at a very local scale about decisions like infrastructure, investing in their docks or port facilities. A fishery, obviously there are day-to-day decisions around operations, but thinking about not just operations at sort of an individual operator level, how can we manage that fishery well, given some of the dynamics that we're experiencing? So that gets into things like setting harvest level, and then also determining who has access and how much access they have to that fishery. And then finally, the management system might operate on a longer time scale and a larger spatial scale, thinking about how to account for some of the trends that are occurring in the ecosystem. So before I keep talking about adaptation, I just want to introduce a definition from the National Academy of Science study back in 2010. And what I really want to point out from this definition is that adaptation is about both mitigating some of the negative impacts that we expect, but also thinking about how can we create new opportunities from the conditions that we expect to occur in the future. And I think both of those elements are really important, and both will be really important for us to be successful moving forward. So some of the work that I'm doing around adaptation involves assessing vulnerabilities as well as opportunities that might occur in fisheries. We are doing several different things around providing climate-relevant information at a community scale and for the industry, and then also supporting capacity building within the industry and in particular communities. So I'm going to focus the rest of my talk, though, on some work we're doing around assessing vulnerability of fishing communities along the northeast coast. So we are conducting a social and ecological vulnerability assessment for about 75 fishing communities from Maine down to northern North Carolina. In this work, we are thinking about what we expect the climate to look like out in mid-century under the RCP 8.5, sort of business as usual climate scenario. And then we ask 3 questions as we walk through this framework. So the first piece we're trying to get to is the ecological impact of these climate changes on the system. And this, we really boil down to a question about species availability. How will species availability change in the system? And we were approaching this work by putting together information from a qualitative expert species vulnerability assessment, where a number of scientists in the region sat down and went through a variety of different factors, how it will play out against the life histories of a number of different species, and basically determine for all these species how exposed they are expected to be to a range of climate conditions and how sensitive they are to those conditions. So what this does is give us a broad perspective on many of the changes that are likely to influence these different species, but it's done at a shelf-wide scale. So we can't distinguish, for example, in the lobster work I just spoke about, from this assessment we wouldn't be able to distinguish southern New England lobster from Gulf of Maine lobster, and we see that the future looks very different for those two. So we then couple this with species distribution models that we're developing in our lab, and from that work we can look at how we expect changes to occur in location of species in the future. So we have a baseline period. We use the model for that baseline period to project to mid-century, which is the time frame for the species vulnerability assessment as well. And we can look at which areas are likely to change. But the change is really important at a local level. So the next part of this framework is trying to get at social impact of these changes. And the question we're asking is, how will the local community be affected, particularly given its dependence on different species and the area of the ocean that it uses for its fisheries. So in each community that we're working in, we're able to take this shelf-wide projection of species change in the future and look at the footprints of where the fishery operating out of that port is actually operating. So this is from vessel trip report data. And then we can cut those species changes to just that footprint and try to understand the local changes, or to localize those changes to a particular place. And then finally, adaptive capacity of that community is also really important. We are approaching this right now for this sort of full-scale vulnerability assessment by using some indicators that have been developed by one of my colleagues on this project, Lisa Colburn, that relate to fishing community vulnerability and resilience. And it focuses on 3 indices that capture resilience and vulnerability. Those relate to general social vulnerability, gentrification, and the engagement and reliance of the community on fisheries. So we can take that information and look at not only how strong we expect some of the ecosystem changes to be in terms of how they play out in that community, but what general perspective can we gain on the community's adaptive capacity, the ability to respond to those changes. This, though, is at a pretty high level. These are sort of standard indicators that can be derived from data sets like the census. So we're also trying to dig into this piece a bit more deeply and to structure our work here around understanding not just what kind of impact do we expect, but how could different adaptation strategies buffer those outcomes or shape those outcomes. So for this work, we're doing we're developing a couple of different economic models. So for 4 communities, we're diving in more deeply than for the shelf-wide vulnerability assessment. We're developing an optimization model of the harvest sector, so the fishing sector in those communities, and then also applying an input-output model to understand the secondary economic effects of those changes. So for our focus communities here, we're looking at 2 ports that are heavily dependent on just one species. Stonington, Maine, which is the purple dot, and New Bedford, Mass, which is the red dot. So these are, Stonington derives most of its value in its port from lobster, and New Bedford, most of that value comes from scallops. And then we have 2 ports, Portland, Maine, and Point Judith, Rhode Island, that have much more diverse fisheries. So in these ports, we are working with, we're doing interviews in those communities to try to understand how they are thinking about adaptation, what kinds of strategies they are already using or interested in for the future, trying to understand what they can do now versus what they want to be able to do, and there may be barriers currently that need to be cleared to make those options be viable. So just to give you a sense of some of the things that we're hearing as we go through these interviews in terms of what people are doing and are interested in, we're hearing a lot of people talk about how the industry is already changing. So after the 2012 heat wave, we saw in the lobster fishery a lot of focus on improving product handling, so things like aerating the water in their tanks so they can increase the oxygen concentration, chilling the tanks so that they reduce the temperatures, being really careful about how they move the product from the boat to the dealers. We're also seeing changes in our supply chain. We have a lot more processing capacity now in Maine, so it's closer, transportation distance is shorter, and it buffers us a bit from being completely dependent on Canadian processors. And then also big focus on marketing and creating new markets for this product to increase the value as a buffer to potential downturns in volume. The other change that we are seeing across a number of fisheries is one I mentioned earlier, that people are changing where they fish, and they're changing what they fish for. This is already happening. We're also seeing a lot of interest in diversifying catch. So this might be a person on the water, a commercial fisherman, who's deciding, well, I don't want to just try to fish for lobsters, I also want to catch jelly crabs. Those are increasing as water temperatures warm. So they're already starting to think about how those might play out against each other in the future and move into some of the species that they see becoming more prevalent in the area. But we're also seeing people diversify into things like aquaculture. So a group of fishermen might come together and decide to start an aquaculture operation and use that as a way of reducing, particularly for some of our lobster communities, reducing their dependence on just one fishery. And then finally, there's been a lot of interest in the seafood supply chain and local seafood, and fishermen who are really interested in whether they can play a greater role in that seafood consumption end and retain a larger portion of the value of their product by both just sort of cutting out the middleman in for some portion of their catch, but also in terms of really thinking about the quality of catch that they're bringing to the docks. And this, plays out at a local level in terms of thinking about what are consumer preferences in a given place. How can those preferences keep up with some of the changes that we're seeing in the ecosystem? And then also being sure there's processing capacity for the new species. So one of the species that we are seeing a lot more of in southern New England is scup. So it's the fish I showed in this picture here. And it's really bony. It's a thin-bodied fish. It's consumed by some of our immigrant communities who are really familiar with eating whole fish, but not by, a lot of people who want to go to the seafood counter and buy a clean fillet. So there's a group of fishermen in Rhode Island who have actually taken the lead on investing in freezing technology and processing equipment for scup so that they can process this fish and make it be a product that can be much more widely consumed. So in this work, we're also trying to understand what are the factors that might facilitate or maybe constraining adaptation. And we're looking at these from both an institutional perspective. Obviously, to be able to fish emerging species, they first need access to quota and permits for those species, which is a huge challenge right now for some of our fisheries. But there's also got to be an individual willingness and interest in changing. And so we're trying to play this out at both of those levels to understand some of the factors that will shape adaptation. And some of the challenges that we are seeing is just that the pace of the change in our ecosystem right now is so fast that it's really outpacing the ability of the management system to keep up, and in many cases of people themselves to be able to sort of want to adjust to those changes and feeling like they're stable enough that they know how to adjust. We're also seeing real challenges around the value of traditional species, especially lobster and scallops, which are really high value, versus the new species that are coming in. They're much lower value. I showed you scup as one example. It sells for about 10 cents per pound. So it is extremely low value, and there's real hope that the ability to process it will dramatically increase the value derived from that species. But these are big unknowns right now. And then also a real need, people have been thinking a lot about sea level rise, so it's a little bit daunting to them to realize that they need to be also thinking about some of the changes in the ecosystem and how those will affect their community. And to be able to put those two together is really important. You know, obviously you don't want to invest a lot of money in a community dock when in the future maybe your vessels operating on that port are going to look different and need different types of docking facilities and infrastructure on those wharves. So I just want to come back to this figure because I want to highlight that right now in the work that we're doing, we're seeing a lot of coping and adaptation happening at the individual, industry, and community levels. What we're not seeing is that same level of adaptation happening in the management system. And we are quickly coming to a point where the ability to adapt at an individual or community level is being constrained by the lack of adaptation in the management system. So this is a huge challenge that we're facing and trying to come up with solutions and propose alternatives to get around. And then finally, I just want to draw all of this together, highlighting a few of the key points that I tried to make in this talk, that the Northeast Shelf is warming extremely rapidly. We're already seeing impacts on some of the species in the region, both some of our traditionally important species like cod, lobster, and shrimp. We're seeing new species coming in. So there is, I think, a real potential for those species to offer opportunities in the future, but we're going to have to be able to find ways of truly turning those into opportunities. We're moving beyond just seeing impacts on species to seeing impacts on fisheries and human communities. And that right now, the industry and communities are really at the forefront of responding to those changes. So I think as we look forward, thinking about how management bodies as well as more formalized decision makers think about the future, that needs to be really factored into decision-making processes to a much greater extent than we're seeing that occur right now. So I'm going to end by acknowledging just a few of my collaborators. This is the effort or work that brings together, what I presented here brings together work that's been done by many people. These are just my collaborators whose work showed up on the slides. And so there's a lot more behind this than just these 5 collaborators. I also want to acknowledge the funders for this work. It comes from a variety of different sources. And I want to also thank the Pew Marine Fellows Program for supporting my travel to be here today. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that you all might have and look forward to talking about these ideas further.
I have 2 questions. First of all, has there been any spatially explicit ecosystem modeling done on those regions, like using EcoSpace or Atlantis or any framework of that sort?
No, we have a number of different distribution modeling efforts coming together, not just for commercial species, but for a number of our protected species, mammals, those types of things. There is a group at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center that is developing ecosystem models, particularly using Atlantis. I have not seen results from those yet, even at meetings, like informally, just initial presentations, so I'm not sure what the status of that work is. But I do think that right now a lot of our understanding is built around individual species and changing overlap between individual species, and in a few cases actually changing interactions between those few species, but really scaling it up to an ecosystem perspective, I think is going to be incredibly important in the future.
And the second question I have is, what kind of product would you expect to be generated from this scup? I'm not sure whether it's an oily or white-fleshed fish. I don't know what kind of...
Yeah, it's a white-fleshed fish. It is flakier than like cod. I I caught some this summer and I used it in fish tacos and they were great. But
Yeah, but it's not something you put into it. You were saying you won't get a good fillet, so it's not something you put in fish and chips or anything like that.
you actually, I think, could use it for fish and
Okay.
chips. Yeah, it's not going to be a huge chunk, but I think you would get some stuff that are an appropriate size for fish and chips.
Okay.
Increasingly, fisheries in the world are yielding surimi,
Well, yeah,
which
of
is
course.
basically like fish flakes jammed together into the fake crabs you can, or fish balls and things.
I
So
guess,
anytime you see surimi, you should assume this fishery is in very poor shape or facing some real challenges.
except for Alaska pollock, I guess, it seems to be in pretty good shape, and that's mostly what it's going into.
Okay,
Yeah.
One of the strategies you were saying is fishes are changing from one species to another. And in Mexico, for example, a lot of the last years would be fighting for having specific species permits. And so now I'm thinking we've been trying to get fisheries management to be more specific on species and stocks so we can get data. But then now maybe what we actually need is the opposite and have groupings, or so can you at least at that point, and then how the legal framework plays into that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I mean, we have gone to sort of single species management and putting controls on things by individual species for very good reasons, you know, as you highlighted. But right now in our system, I feel like we are seeing that as a major point where we have lost a lot of resilience in the system. I mean, you constantly hear fishermen talk about how they used to go out and sort of flexibly catch what was there. If something was abundant, they would go for that instead of trying to find the things that seem to be more scarce, and maybe there's a reason they're scarce and should be left alone. So I think this is a situation that is becoming extremely problematic as we see species move. One of the ways it's playing out in our region, for example, is that the sort of rich fisheries are able to buy permits for other species much more easily than many of the small operators. So for example, right now we have plenty of permits available for Jonah crabs, but in the past 6 months, I would say, I've heard so many people talk about how the scallopers have become really interested in those permits. The price has more than quadrupled. So it's really put it out of a point where small operators could buy those permits thinking that this is going to be a productive species for the future. They're already getting outpriced by the big operators. And so I think this is a huge challenge that even where there is flexibility in the system to create access to species that may be becoming more prevalent, very quickly we're already seeing some of the wealthier operators recognize that as a buffering opportunity for the future and outcompete the small operators. So this is a huge challenge, I think. And we're actually, I think in a couple of our fisheries, some flounder and black sea bass especially, this is quickly how to deal with these allocation issues and the fact that we're locked into state-by-state quotas that were set back in the 80s when the distribution looked very different. This is already coming sort of to a head, and there are things on the table in sort of management settings. I don't know, it's extremely political to shift quota around, but it's also a space where I think we're going to be moving into doing some work with the industry to try to build industry buy-in for what kinds of options seem to be acceptable. How can you look at trade-offs and think about some of the ways that one place that might benefit could think about other opportunities for places that may be losing quota. But I think it's also a real challenge, the way that we've set up our current system and structured it so rigidly around historical fishing experiences. Right now, for example, with summer flounder, we have more than 70% of the quota aligned with less than 50% of the stock. So you have really intense fishing potential. It's really shifting, you know, how we think about stock sustainability too, I think, and has the potential to create problems with the ways we place fishing effort on those stocks. So I think there's a need to realign some of our ways of doing things, not just for the social and economic reasons, but also for biological reasons as well.
That was really a very interesting comment on social and economic justice on some level. Another question that comes to mind is whether, in fact, with the warming, we're going to be able to sustain the economic policy from the study fishers. And because although in the adaptation tactics you mentioned there were quite a lot of interesting ideas, the presumption seems to be they'd stay in the game. And I'm wondering what discussion there is about who's going to have to leave the game and how the industry structuring and management structuring might influence that.
Well, I definitely think that there is some assumption that there will be attrition. We've already lost a lot of our groundfish vessels as we've seen those stocks decline. But I'd say aging of our fishermen is a really big concern across all of our fisheries. So there's some expectation that there's just not going to be interest in replacing all those people that will be leaving as they get older. And then also that creates an opportunity for controlling numbers a bit better without forcing someone out. Maybe it reduces opportunities to get in, but you don't actively have to force people out, which has been extremely painful as we've gone through some of our groundfish downturns.
But of course it doesn't need to be people, it's fishing effort, right? So you wonder if
Yeah.
we'll just force some of the small operators out and consolidate in effort in some of the larger operators.
Right, yeah, exactly. I think New England is really interesting as a place that has been very focused on protecting its small boat fleets. And I think that there's obviously a risk of that. But even the way we structured our groundfish quota system and sectors was really built around protecting smaller operators. And so I don't see us moving to a system that would look like Alaska, for example. I think that the social, cultural, and historical significance of fisheries is so great there that this is something that's at the forefront of every discussion about how to do things, is protecting the sort of the feel of the fisheries and the cultural history and the ways, the owner-operator nature of our fisheries.
I had a question about, so a number of the species that you mentioned, like the salmon flounder and the black sea bass and stuff, I know they go into estuarine areas.
You know what?
Well, they go into estuarine areas.
Uh-huh.
And with the region that you were discussing was the Chesapeake Bay. So I was wondering if the seasonal warming is projected to affect some of these like large region-wide estuarine restoration efforts, particularly in the Chesapeake Bay. And if that's being taken into account when kind of projecting the fishery.
That's a great question, and the answer is essentially no to that last question. I mean, I think this is a place we need a lot more attention, is putting together some of the changes in habitat that we expect with how those habitats play into providing the potential for productivity in the fish stocks. And I would say that, at least in our area, this is a connection that is not being made. I right now am serving on a habitat committee, and there is some sense that, we need to map the important fish habitats for those estuarine areas, but not really creating the models that connect those habitats in terms of our understanding of fish productivity and how it's likely to play out. And in terms of, potential effects on restoration, I think people are thinking a lot about sea level rise, but not really about some of the other effects in terms of warming, acidification, those types of things. And so I could give you a much longer answer, but I think, yes, we've invested a lot in habitat restoration, and it would be a real shame to not think about how we sustain that.